Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Joe Hepworth. I'm the Regional Director for the Middle East for OCO Global. And I'd like to welcome you to this webinar today, Navigating the Israeli Business Landscape, Opportunities for UAE Companies in the Post-COVID World. Over the course of the next hour or so, we're going to take you through an overview of some of the things we do, but in particular what's happening in Israel, an overview of the Israeli economy, what's happening in certain sectors, and then I think a fundamentally important part about how to actually do business there and the cultural ways of doing things. And what I would say as well is please do put in Q&A. We've got the Q&A box on the bottom of Zoom there. We'll address those at the end when we're leaving plenty of time for you to address questions that you would ask. So please do participate and send us your questions, comments, and things you'd like us to discuss, and we'll make sure we get back to them. So my name's Joe Hepworth. I'm OCO's Middle East Director based here in Dubai in the UAE. I've been here for 12 years. Joining us today is our Israel Director in Tel Aviv, Elisa Rappaport, and two colleagues from the law firm Yigal, Arnon, that's Nimrod, Vromen, and Daniel Damboretz, apologies Daniel, who are going to give us some of the flavour on the legal side and the macro side. So welcome to our colleagues from Israel today. And obviously we're here because things have moved very quickly from just sort of 2 months ago and a month ago when the Abraham Accords were signed in Washington. Obviously we've already seen first flights between the two countries, and I saw today that there are sort of tentative outlines for the likes of Emirates and Etihad and Fly Dubai and El Al and some of the Israeli airlines to start flying in January, and I think that's more due to COVID restrictions than anything else. And in the last month, we've seen entities like DP World, like Adio, like the Habtoor Group announcing major plans and in some cases major investments and business deals already between the two countries. So things are moving quickly, and I hope that what we provide for you today is supportive in terms of your business interests in opening up this channel. Obviously the context that we're operating in, and this is the latest in terms of what's happening in Israel, which I think some of you may be aware went into a very serious national lockdown, a second national lockdown rather, just over a month ago before a number of the Jewish holidays, whereas in the UAE we're sort of seeing cases around the 1,000 mark. I think in Israel they've been around the 3,000 mark. So I think there's a number of greater degree, let's say, of COVID and COVID management happening in Israel at the moment than there is here in the UAE. Hence, second lockdowns and some very strict rules in terms of foreigners entering the country and that sort of thing. So just in terms of who we are and why we can help you with this. So OCO Global, we're a global trade and investment consultancy. We work all over the world, as you can see here. We have offices worldwide, approximately 100 staff, and we help both governments with trade and investment promotion, but also private companies where we support market entry, market growth, exporting, trading, setting up overseas. We've been in Dubai for 7 years, and in recent years we've done increasing work in Tel Aviv with Elisa on a number of projects, which I'll come on to. Keep going, one more. I mean, this is perhaps not so relevant for this webinar because this is some of the work we've done in the UAE. So if you're wanting to find out about things in the UAE, we'll send you the webinar we did a month ago on Israel into the UAE. But it gives a flavour of some of the things we do where, over the last 5 or 6 years, we've helped over 450 companies come in. We've recorded, we believe, in excess of $150 million in terms of export wins. We have a special market setup solution here that we operate with our partners at Dubai SME to allow foreign companies to come in and set up here. And that's the sort of thing we're doing in the UAE. Around the region, we're very active as well, and obviously we can sort of extend that map up to the left now and up to the top now for future. We work with governments around the region. We've done or are doing projects in Oman with 3 or 4 governments in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, and in Jordan. So typically that involves helping government entities with investment attraction and or helping their exporters grow overseas. And our team here in the UAE, and we've added Elisa to that, is I think very representative of the UAE in terms of a multinational crew. I think we speak, it says there 9 languages. I think it might be more, and we've probably got 8 different nationalities in our team there, which represents the UAE's demographics, and we cover all sectors here as we do in Israel. So now I'm going to hand over to Nimrod, who's a partner at Yigal, Arnon. Nimrod's going to talk you through sort of the macro context, but I think very interesting, also a bit of a sort of recent history on how things have developed in Israel over the last 60 to 70 years. As you can see here from his bio, Nimrod's a real sort of startup man and involved with a lot of early stage companies. So Nimrod, over to you. If you unmute your microphone, and we'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Great. So I'm just gonna skip the personal bio here. I'm going to skip the personal bio here, and what I'm going to do is something a little bit different. First of all, thanks everyone for attending. And it's an honor to take part in this webinar and to tell you a little bit about Israel. I'm very optimistic about the agreement that was signed and all the business that we can do together in the future. And I can't wait to come and visit. When Israelis sort of explain about Israel to you, they will have a tendency to tell you a lot of facts about the current situation. But in my experience, I think history has a very important part in explaining where Israel is today in the tech industry. And I can't reliably tell you about the history before I was born. So I'm going to sort of tell you about the history of the Israeli tech economy from when I was born. And I'm going to throw in a few facts and events that happened along sort of my lifetime and tie things together in for you. And what I hope you'll take away from it is also how involved every Israeli is in the sort of high-tech community. It's a very small town, and when you come and visit here and start doing business here, you will feel that it's a very small town. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone had an experience with everyone, and you'll see it also in this story, and you'll see that everything ties into everything as well, from history to today. So in 1982, I was born in May. In June, began a conflict in the north with Lebanon. It's the first one that, the first one in my lifetime. And it actually essentially threw Israel into a terrible financial recession in 1983, aside from all the other ramifications of that event. The financial recession in 1983, there's always a catalyst to a financial recession. And the catalyst to the financial recession in 1983 was that Israelis lost their faith in bank bonds and bank investments that were made earlier. And loss of faith in bank investments in a country where the real estate is still not yet very attractive to outside buyers means you don't have a lot of other places to invest, aside from taking gambles and going a little bit high risk, especially when, politically speaking, you are an island and can't do that much business abroad, even if you wanted to. So this recession really was the catalyst also for the growth of the tech ecosystem, and not many people speak about it. We lost $7 billion out of a $27 billion GDP in that recession. So you can see how small our GDP was back then and how large our contraction was back then. And just to give you a sense of comparison, we never lost that much. Our economy never shrunk that much. And the COVID shrink is far smaller, by hundreds of percent smaller than this shrink from 1983. In 1985, as a follow-up to that, you could see that people wanted to start investing in venture capital, in high tech, in innovation that Israelis were always trying out. And the first venture capital fund was incorporated, Athena. A recovery plan for the recession was adopted by the government. By the way, Athena was incorporated by the former Air Force commander, a general, an Air Force commander. And it was one of the first instances where a military commander starts a tech venture, albeit a venture capital fund and not a startup. But it was one of those beginnings of that relationship between the Israeli military and some of the startups that incorporate, which you should know is the case when doing business here. The fund was focused on NASDAQ IPO opportunities. The fund was an exit-geared fund. It wasn't looking to build big companies necessarily. It was looking to build companies that will eventually IPO on the NASDAQ and transition to the United States. Another important thing that happened in 1985 was Operation Moses. It was the first sort of mass immigration operation where Israelis brought in, since after World War II and the beginning of the country's existence, where Israelis brought in thousands of Ethiopians. And this experience was important because several years later, it was actually a prelude to something much bigger that helped our tech ecosystem. Throughout this period, sorry, I can't see what's happening underneath here in the slides. Throughout this period, so I was born 1985, I was still a kid, nothing interesting to say, and we can go to the next slide. Great. In 1988, the Soviet Union collapsed. This is very important for the Israeli tech economy's history. I actually went to Australia in 1988 to live with my parents. My father went there to raise money from Australian Jews in order to support mass immigration from Ethiopia and the former Soviet Union into Israel. So my parents and my family took part in raising money for this initiative because the government did not have money to support the hundreds of thousands of immigrants that were coming in. And I would go back and forth with my parents from Australia to Israel until 1991. And actually one of those times I landed in Abu Dhabi when I was 8 years old in 1990. And I wrote in my diary, I had a little kid's diary, and I wrote that it was the most beautiful place I had ever seen in my life. We came in, I admit, today I can admit this statute of limitation applies. I came in on my Dutch passport, and I was enamored as an 8-year-old child enough to write it in my diary. So the most beautiful airport and buildings I've ever seen. So in 1990, Russian immigration began. The second venture capital fund, the second Israeli venture capital fund was formed. That's Veritas. And we actually started taking in 1 million Russians. These Russian Jews would eventually become the engineers that are the backbone of the tech ecosystem. Many of the engineers and the developers in the Israeli tech ecosystem are either first or second generation Russian immigrants from the former Soviet Union. So the 90s were very important in that sense. I came back to Israel to live in 1991 with my family. And in 1993, the government started investing in tech. Through tax incentives given to foreign venture capital funds, the government created Yozma. Yozma is responsible for increasing venture capital investments in Israel from $58 million in 1993 to $3.3 billion a year annually just a few years later, which is huge and basically brought it to a point where it's #1 in the world in venture capital investments per capita. We can go on to the next slide. Thank you. In 1995, as I was celebrating my bar mitzvah, the internet bubble began internationally. In Israel, a very important event occurred in October 1994. We had peace with Jordan. So we were sort of in a political place where we were ripe for investing in our own technology and our own growth. We had the Oslo Accords and we had peace with Jordan, which was very important, signed in October 1994. And we also had to deal internally with the Rabin assassination, which did slow down some processes, but also got a right-wing government which was all for hyper growth at that point. It's important to say economically. I went back to Australia with my family for another 3 years to continue to support the Russian immigration that continued to grow during these 3 years. I came back to Israel in 1998, and all I could see in the news was the first big exit. 3 founders who founded a company called Mirabilis that had developed a product called ICQ, sold their company for a whopping $407 million to AOL. This acquisition, which is equivalent of a couple of billion today, basically created the incentive for founders to build companies to what is essentially an exit. If they could get rich and make money after building a serious enough company that a large American conglomerate will want to turn it into a center of excellence in Israel, this is what will drive them and this is what they'll do. And many companies went down the miraculous path right afterwards. It was the first really important exit when I landed back in Israel. In 1999, just before the internet bubble burst, Israel was at its peak as well. $12.5 billion in tech revenues, up from $1.6 billion in tech revenues from the early 90s. The #1 country in the world in R&D investments per capita by far, and this remains this way today. And a small company was incorporated by a professor of the Jerusalem Hebrew University, a company called Mobileye. If you don't know it yet, you will have heard about it dozens of times when other people present Israel to you, and we'll get to Mobileye later on in my presentation. But remember, it was incorporated by a professor in Hebrew University. The relationship between universities and companies started around there. In 2001, recovery began from the bubble bursting in 2000. Universities, more people remained in university. That's what people do when they don't have money or they don't have jobs. They go and they take another degree. And they started their startups within universities, which continue to develop the relationship between universities and entrepreneurship. Government funding continued to try and support high tech, and I began my military service. I just want to give you two takeaways from my military service. One is that there's a very tight relationship between military trying out different products and companies outside of the military, and it helps companies develop and test their products. But two, and this is more importantly, something to know about the Israeli military, nobody respects command in the Israeli military. The commanders have nicknames. They're not called by sir or captain or commander. And this sort of very non-hierarchical structure is one of the factors that promotes entrepreneurship and innovation in the civil space after your service, because you sort of continue to question and doubt any authority that you're faced with. Because if in the most hierarchical body you were in, you could question authority and call your commander by that person's nickname, then if you're employed by another company like Intel, you can of course question Intel's authority. And that's what happened in 2005. 2005, enough engineers questioned Intel's development of chips based on the Moore law, such that Intel invested $3.5 billion to open a chip development site for Core 2 Duo in order to face the problems of the overheating microchips based on the Moore law developments. And Intel built their first big center of excellence of a large company in Israel, which spawned a lot of other companies to come in. Immediately in 2006, M Systems acquired SanDisk by $1.5 billion. SanDisk was the creator, sorry, M Systems was acquired by SanDisk. M Systems had created the USB port and stick. And Mercury was acquired by HP, and HP bid for $4.5 billion, the biggest exit until such date. And they created a center of excellence in Israel as well. You can go on to the next slide. Thank you. In 2008, another global financial crisis commenced, and I was a student of law in Tel Aviv University. So I decided to incorporate a company. The company was called You Tell Me, and it was a platform for copyright trading, a platform for people who do small jobs, copyright jobs for people who ask for these jobs. So I had my own startup as well for 2 years. In 2009, end of 2009, as we were recovering from the global financial crisis, I closed You Tell Me. Most startups in Israel fail. And my co-founder from You Tell Me incorporated a new company. We'll get to that in a moment. And I joined Yigal Arnon as a lawyer and started representing startups. Now, You Tell Me's biggest competitor when it was incorporated was Fiverr. We'll get to that in a moment. And in 2010, my first job as a lawyer was to represent one of the biggest US venture capital funds in the world, Bessemer Venture Partners, in its investment in Fiverr, UTellMe's competitor. So you can imagine my dismay at helping Fiverr grow while we were closing UTellMe. In 2011, just as an anecdote, that's when I met Liz Rappaport, who's on this team. And I went with her to Australia as part of a very large peace initiative that was initiated by the Paris Peace Center. So I was in Australia again in 2011. And in 2013, my friend and former partner from UTellMe sold ClarityRay, his company, which we represented from day one, to Yahoo. And Yahoo created a center of excellence in Israel as well, yet another center of excellence of a large international, multinational conglomerate, which I hope that you guys will also see as an opportunity in the future as our relationship evolves. In that very same year, Google acquired Waze for $1 billion and also set up a large center of excellence in Israel, something that is big, you can see is a repetitive part of this story. Well, this is the second last slide now. In 2015, I started representing an Australian fund called SquarePeg. I like to represent foreign funds who are investing in Israeli companies. And SquarePeg's first investment, lo and behold, 60 million, it started with 40 and grew to 60 in Fiverr. So you can see Fiverr keeps coming back until it IPO'd last year, I think. In 2017, Mobileye was sold to Intel, and our firm represented Intel in the acquisition of Mobileye. My department did that, and I'm very proud of that, for $15.3 billion, the biggest exit in Israel's history, and a very exciting moment also for the relationship between universities and founders, because as you remember, 18 years earlier, Mobileye was founded by a university professor. In 2018, we incorporated YTech Runway, a platform that provides content and tools for entrepreneurs, investors, and other players in the tech ecosystem in Tel Aviv. I invite you to join the website. It's in my contact details that you'll get after the webinar. The website has a lot of information about the tech ecosystem that you can use. And in 2020, we arrived at our agreement between the Emirates and Israel, which we're all very excited about. We're facing COVID, which is causing a contraction in the market, but VC investments in Israel are up 20%. We can explain why if you want to discuss it offline, not as part of this presentation. There are many reasons for it. And our firm incorporated a consulting firm for tech companies called Consigliere. And Consigliere's mission is to help foreign investors and acquirers and business partners outside of Israel engage with startups as they learn the Israeli ecosystem. And that's 1982 till today. This investment just sort of summarizes, this slide just sort of summarizes everything that I said, so I won't repeat it to save time. And I'll give the mic off to you, Joe.
Brilliant. Nimrod, thank you. Fascinating, and you seem to have done an awful lot in not very much time. So an inspiration to us all. And I think just on that last slide, I mean, Abby, can you just go back one slide? I mean, there's quite a lot of similarities there with the UAE, and we've always said the population is similar, but in terms of governmental encouragement, natural resources, okay, the UAE has lots of hydrocarbons, but very little in terms of agriculture and that sort of thing. Immigration and foreign immigration being a sort of key part to growth. There's so many similarities between the two countries. Okay, Abby, let's move forward. And now introducing startup guy, Daniel. Is it fair to say that you're the corporate guy? So also a partner at Yigal Arnon, and Daniel's going to talk us through now some of the sector developments in Israel. So welcome to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here as well. And if to add on to what Nimrod said, yeah, so Nimrod and I partners in the same group. We do much of the same work. He got the luxury of speaking about the sexy elements of Israel's developing high-tech industry, and I'm going to try and give you a bit of an overview of what you might be looking into as you work through potential transactions with an Israeli company. Okay, so as you've heard, Israel is really kind of considers itself as a startup nation. The level of entrepreneurship, the number of people involved is extremely high in entrepreneurship. And that ranks through the Israeli army, universities, hospitals, and that requires actually taking a look at it, at all those aspects when you do deals. In Israel, you collaborate with ventures in Israel. I want to stop for a moment on this slide, and Israeli companies very often develop technology, and we've grown to learn that there's sometimes a need to understand how it works in terms of a relationship with the company holding this technology. Very often the conversation is about a transfer, but we've come across issues when misunderstanding the concept. And ultimately, speaking of all these companies that Nimrod mentioned that were acquired, and there are many more obviously that were acquired in Israel's short history, but the acquirers are always looking for this IP. They always need it. And therefore, when doing deals which are commercial by nature, joint venture by nature, the Israeli companies cannot really transfer the technology. What they could do is license it. The license is a lot more flexible, and we can determine it, the scope of the license, and with the exclusivities, the territories in which this would work. But it allows at the same time the company that holds the technology, the IP, to continue to grow. This is generally a win-win solution. So if anyone here on this panel is looking at Israeli companies to create a joint venture with them, bring technology in to UAE, this would probably be the best method to do so via a certain license. If we can move on to the next slide. Okay, when you're looking at technology, it's very important to understand who owns the IP and the know-how, okay? You guys will need your lawyers to look into who created the IP, whether it was assigned properly to the company, and it requires the necessary due diligence, and often just simple, in what we call legal terms, reps and warranties that the company actually owns the IP. We can move forward. Basically, in Israeli companies, this is how it would work. The diagram you see here. Founders will come up with an idea. They'll start working on it, whether it's in their parents' garage when they're young, whether it's an idea they've come across in their military service and waiting to exploit it once they leave, whether they're in university and come up with the idea, or even in various hospitals and they're coming up with some medical solution. They will then bring it into a company at some stage, and they will they might need to acquire other licenses, and they will, once that company is funded, they will usually hire employees and consultants. All their knowledge, all their development will also become the company's assets. Okay, everything will be built in to this Israeli company, which is again the company that you will later look to partner with or form a joint venture with. We can move forward. So a lot of these companies require transactions with universities, medical institutions, as mentioned, and the concept here is, again, the universities want to protect their right and title to the IP. So we often find companies in need to negotiate with the universities and medical institutions and grant either issue them shares in the company or grant them royalties upon exits. We've seen multiple and various methods of working with universities and hospitals, and in exchange for that, the universities and hospitals typically give these companies a blanket waiver to allow them to continue to develop. For example, I would say Nimrod mentioned earlier Mobileye. Mobileye was a company that was founded by professors in Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and there was a need to figure out and work out the rights there. Many companies are similar. We've had Intel acquisitions where consultants in the company were involved in the technology and the creation of the technology, who were in other universities, allowed the universities in situations where it wasn't settled to come forward and actually make claims towards ownership of the IP. So bear that in mind. That is something that needs to be dealt with, or make sure that it has been dealt with prior to entering any type of joint venture. Okay, we can move forward. So it's important to understand Israel has several laws that govern IP situations in the company. One of them is many companies in Israel are funded by the Israeli government. The Israeli government basically gives a grant to many companies in Israel. There are laws that govern this relationship. There are many forms of these grants. Very few of them, if any, grant the government any equity in the company. And usually it's a relationship of royalties upon sales. Again, the government is just mainly looking to boost the Israeli economy. And this is one of the ways it subsidizes it. There are, for better or for worse, strings attached to it, which makes you need to know that all development of the IP in companies of that type need to be done within Israel. And if IP is taken out of Israel, there are, I would call it, for the lack of any other word, is a fine of several multiples on the amount funded. So it requires to negotiate this with the Israel Innovation Authority, that is the entity that funds these companies. The IDF, the Israeli Army, as well, and the Ministry of Defense also have their requirements, and they too require that in order to provide permits for soldiers to work on ventures that are related to matters that are in the space of what they were doing in the army, they provide with they're also going to be asked to provide with a certain waiver. And of course, there are other matters that relate to encryption controls and data privacy, which is becoming more and more of a necessity in GDPR worlds of today. GDPR, while it doesn't apply in Israel, Israel has its own privacy laws, which are fairly similar in many aspects. Okay, we can move forward. Okay, just as maybe a summary to what we've heard until now, and to drift away for a moment from the actual legal issues. I want to give you a bit of a flavor of mine to what causes and interests many foreign investors and joint ventures to play within the Israeli ecosystem. So Israel is has the largest number of high-tech companies outside of the US, okay? It has the highest per capita investment dollars in the world. In 2019 itself, Israel's high tech raised $8.3 billion in 522 transactions. That's an increase. And while the numbers in 2020 aren't out yet, I will carefully say that I'm not even expecting much, if any, of a downturn as a result of COVID. Nimrod can attest to it as well. We've been very, very fortunate within the firm to continue to remain extremely busy throughout this entire term. In terms of building a healthy and large ecosystem within Israel, you can see that in 2019, 41 companies raised amounts that are larger than $50 million, 20 of which were larger than $100 million. Again, in terms of understanding how small of an economy, how small of a country Israel is, those numbers are absolutely enormous. The only shrink that we actually saw was in initial early seed financing transactions. In terms of the last bullet at the bottom, we'll show you the split between the sectors. But as Nimrod and I like to say, we as corporate lawyers are sector agnostic. So we're still trying to learn what interests people in the UAE, but you can see below that capital raising is all these hot areas. Many of them can probably be completely relevant on a global scale. And again, investors have been involved in all these deals globally. Any more slides? Are we done? Okay. So maybe the last, and to summarize, okay, we really feel this is an exciting time for collaborations between UAE and Israel. Israel, with its growing economy, is always looking for new avenues to grow its economy. And actually, you know, Israel is tiny. So the technology coming out of Israel is never intended to be left only in Israel. Every founder with a dream dreams of selling globally. And that can be the United States, it can be Europe and Asia and the Arab countries as well. Definitely not limited also to UAE alone. We know that UAE is a window and a prisma to many other countries. And we're really, really looking forward to it. And when I say that, I speak on behalf of many of our founders, clients of ours who have been following these times very, very carefully as well. We feel the exponential growth would be enormous. Also, again, just by UAE being the first of many. So I think we've given you a good idea of the excellent investment opportunities, fantastic collaboration options. Again, be aware there are local Israeli related issues. Political situation in Israel is always shaky. Talking about elections here internally again, but thankfully that the corona, many other things have rarely stopped the growth. Yeah, thinking back and then listening to Nimrod's presentation, you know, thinking to the last economy crash in 2008 and 9, that one hit Israel far less than many other countries. So I feel that, and many thanks to the tech scene here in Israel, which continues to just grow. Last but not least, listen, we're all new to each other. So the cultural differences that we've seen floating around the internet, various manuals and guides that large companies have put out for their business units traveling to Israel to deal and collaborate with Israelis. There are those. We're all going to learn them. Israelis had to learn them when entering the Chinese market. They had to learn it when Russian investors got interested in the Israeli scene, and they're going to learn it now. I think together we're all here to try and bridge those gaps and make that as easy as possible for everyone.
Joe, I think you're still on mute. Okay, hello everybody. Can you hear me, Joe? Okay, great. Hi, so I'm Alyssa Rappaport. For some reason, I lost the signal for a moment. So thank you to Nimrod and Daniel for that very detailed and thorough overview. I'm going to really run through a lot of my slides here because they gave such a great detailed overlook of the Israeli tech ecosystem. This is more just like a general overview, some macroeconomic data. So after all that talk of the large-scale deals and number of companies, you might be surprised to realize that Israel is really geographically tiny, an area of just over 22,000 square kilometers, which fits about 4 times into the UAE, which itself is a small geographical area. Our population sizes are very similar, just over 9 million people. Our GDPs per capita also very similar, 43,000 US dollars per capita. We have low inflation. Unemployment rate was prior to COVID relatively low at 4.9, but as of July, our unemployment here is up to 20%. So, you know, economists are saying it's going to take 4 to 5 years for Israel to recover and get its unemployment rate back down. Tech sector obviously being less impacted, as Nimrod and Daniel touched on. And Israel joined the OECD in May 2010. Next slide. Most of this has been touched on. I will just highlight a few things. It's a very highly educated population, so 49.9% of people the population, sorry, the 49.9% of people have a tertiary education, so that's higher than the OECD average. And interestingly, Israel's population is comprised of 20% of an Arab population, so that's both Muslim and Christian Arabs. So this is also an opportunity for Israel's Arab sector to you know, help us navigate the relations with the UAE, obviously with more ease due to language. Next slide. As has been touched on, Israel is a global leader in technology. I'm not going to go into that because we're already running short on time. Most of it has already been touched on. Next slide. Same with this, more details about the high-tech sector and the money coming in. I will just mention this again because I think it's really quite fundamental and ties into the opportunities that we see between Israel and the UAE, and that is the large number of foreign multinationals that are operating R&D centers here in Israel. So from over 35 countries, we have 530 multinationals that are using Israel as a base to innovate and conduct research and development. We see at least 20 new centers opening annually, and this accounts for about 50% of the R&D expenditure in the business sector. And interestingly, 20% of those R&D centers are actually engaged in manufacturing here in Israel. Next slide. That's coming up rather small, but in your own time you can take a look and see. This gives you an idea of who's here in the ecosystem, what technology verticals they're spread across and where they come from. So obviously the bulk being North American, also a lot of European players, and increasingly over the last 10 years or so, the Asian multinationals are here in Israel as well. Next slide. So Daniel also touched on the Innovation Authority, and I felt it was worth including here as well, because it is so fundamental in terms of the government investment in the innovation and technology ecosystem here, because the government really sees that innovation and technology are key to financial growth. Israel being a small country, having limited natural resources, politically until now being fairly isolated. So, high tech is really so significant, comprising 45% of our export dollars. So the Innovation Authority, as Daniel said, grants funding to early stage startups, to mature companies, to academic groups that are looking to transfer their technologies to market, also to global corporations that are interested in collaborating with Israeli companies, to older Israeli companies that would like to introduce advanced manufacturing, and also to help Israeli companies enter new markets. So they have a variety of tools and mechanisms that help to propel the technology and innovation sector, and are so fundamental to the great success and thriving nature of innovation and technology here in Israel. And importantly, it is a tool for foreign companies as well. So if you look at the 2019 figures, again, just to highlight how fundamental it is, over close to 3,000 companies submitted grants to applications to the Innovation Authority. They granted over 1,500 of those projects, coming in at a budget in 2019 of 1.73 billion shekels. So that's $512 million in 1 year, government funding. This is almost unprecedented, if not unprecedented, anywhere else in the world. The US certainly doesn't spend that much government money on R&D. So just to give you an indication of how fundamental government support is. And there's been research conducted in 2008 at Hebrew University that shows that the return on investment is huge, 2 to 3 times higher value coming in on the government money that goes in. So, that money is going a long, long way and is not acting as a deterrent at all, quite the opposite to foreign venture capital coming in. Next slide. Okay, so now we can highlight some sector opportunities that we feel are really, excellent opportunities for UAE and Israeli companies to collaborate, given the strengths of the sectors here in Israel and, sector needs and strengths also in the UAE. So the first one is ag-tech, agriculture technology. So obviously we're in the same part of the world, one of the most arid regions in the world, and Israel really has pioneered concepts of drip irrigation and recycling and reuse of water for agricultural purposes. And this stems from the kibbutz history of Israel. Since before the establishment of the state, agricultural communes were established in order to try to make Israel as self-sustainable as possible. Given the political situation Israel has found itself in up until today, and so food security and using recycling water has been so fundamental and has really made Israel a major player in the world today for cutting edge agriculture solutions, exporting more than $3 billion annually of ag tech solutions. A few more numbers: 400 Israeli ag tech companies. In 2019, they raised close to $300 million, and there's over 240 Israeli food tech startups. So, your food manufacturers here in Israel are also getting involved in innovation and using technology to do interesting things for the food market. The capabilities range from in-soil and in-tree sensors, using drones for agriculture, plant genetics, cultured meats, alternative proteins, smart irrigation, using big data analytics software. So there are plenty of areas for opportunity, where the UAE can benefit from the technology that are being developed here in Israel, whether it be through licensing like Daniel mentioned, investing and so on, particularly in the areas of food security, seeds and fertilizers, and precision agriculture, which we know are fields that the UAE is trying to get further involved in. Next slide. So the next sector that we would like to highlight is the fintech sector. Very strong here in Israel, more than 500 fintech companies. In 2019, they raised $1.7 billion, which was more than twice of the previous year and triple from 2016. So the industry is really growing. Israel's fintech ecosystem has pioneered the use of technologies such as machine learning, big data analytics, and cloud-based services in the financial industry. And companies range from payment and loans to accounting and anti-fraud, insurance tech, asset management, and important to note again the involvement of the whole sector. So Israeli banks and insurers are involved in running accelerators and innovation centers, running funds as well, investing themselves in Israeli startup companies. And also, of course, we see the multinational players involved as well. We have over 40 of them. So again, plenty of opportunity. Moving along to the next sector that we'd like to highlight, healthcare. Again, a very strong sector here in Israel, whether it be medical devices or pharma or digital health. So we have over 550 digital health companies, again, raising large amounts of venture capital. And interestingly, Israel for over 25 years has been accumulating medical data, and 98% of it is digitalized. And again, we see a huge government involvement in propelling the sector, over $300 million invested in 2018 in a plan for the government to try to grow and propel this sector. And also there are initiatives that encourage Israeli companies to collaborate with multinationals and foreign healthcare systems. So again, there is a huge opportunity for strategic partnerships with UAE hospitals, insurance companies, pharma companies, and universities to try to collaborate with Israeli companies. Next slide. Logistics and distribution. So given that the UAE is such a global hub in terms of the movement of goods, this is another area that there's potential for collaboration. Israel is very strong in what's being called now Industry 4.0, so technologies that are optimizing supply chain and so on. Again, there's just so much opportunity for collaboration, and we see that particularly given COVID, supply chain management and efficiency is so important given restrictions on movement, and the startups in that field here are, just benefiting from the unfortunate situation that the world is in. So there's plenty of area for collaboration. And the next slide. Lastly, I'd like to highlight smart mobility. Again, a very strong sector here in Israel, and I know that this is one of the sectors that the UAE is also investing in, and I know it's one of your sector focuses at Expo 2020, which is now Expo 2021. So this is a very strong sector here in Israel with over 600 startups. Mobileye has been mentioned, autonomous driving. There is a lot happening here in Israel. It's a government initiative as well, going back to 2011 with the Smart Mobility Initiative out of the Prime Minister's office. And we have an annual conference that's run, the Smart Mobility Summit, which is attended by over 5,000 people from around the world each year. And also wanted to mention EcoMotion, which is a nonprofit venture, a collaboration between government ministries, the private sector, bringing together all the players in this ecosystem. Again, we have all the OEMs here that have established R&D centers, Ford, Skoda, they're all here. So again, there's opportunity for collaboration, for UAE companies getting involved in the market in this field. Okay, next slide. Okay, so some market approach tips. I'm going to move away a little bit from technology for a moment and just talk about, selling UAE products here in the market. We recommend using a local agent or a distributor. I'm going to get into that in the next slide. Setting up in market, it's been touched on, can be done through acquisitions, through opening R&D centers, establishing a physical presence, being here physically, of course, when that is enabled, will be hugely helpful to UAE companies. And of course, attending events and exhibitions. Next slide, we highlight some of the key exhibitions in the market. A lot of them now have moved to virtual events. So this week there was DLD Innovation Festival in Israel, which is normally a huge week-long event here in Tel Aviv. It became a one-day virtual event. The same with Medical Device Israel. The Smart Mobility Summit, which I referred to prior, is in November and is moved to a virtual event. So if you're in the smart mobility field, we encourage you to register and attend. There's an annual Agri-Food Tech Investor Summit that is taking place virtually, and all the events that are scheduled for next year currently haven't been delayed, haven't moved virtual, and let's hope that they can take place as planned. So we really encourage you, when travel is allowed, to come into the market and attend. So a little bit more detail about selecting a local partner, distributor, agent. Due diligence is really important. Coming here, meeting them, developing relationships, checking out who else they're working with. Exclusivity is very common here in Israel due to the small market size. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to have your product sold by numerous distributors, and it confuses the market. Very important to have a written contract, have all the details finalized, make sure you understand all the legal parameters, and also keeping in mind pricing. It's a very sophisticated and a very competitive market, so pricing is key. Next slide. A lot of this has been touched on, but I like this slide. It looks at the different ways of physically getting into the market and investing, like we've said, through opening an R&D center, through acquiring a local technology company. And of course, this is very attractive for startup companies in Israel that are strong on the technology side, but really need help scaling up and branching into foreign markets. So this is an opportunity for UAE companies to assist, acquire the technology and help the company grow. Of course, the option of setting up some kind of innovation platform, whether it be an accelerator, a lab, an incubator, and so on. And then also using Israel as a platform to tap into global innovation ecosystems, because everybody is here. This is really a springboard into other markets and other innovation ecosystems. Next slide. Okay, so lastly, some tips on doing business. Of course, the culture is a little bit different. It's a very casual market here, casual business environment. The dress is casual. You'll often see people going to work in jeans. You'll never see anyone in a suit unless it's a government official meeting. In the private sector, people don't even know what a tie is. The official work week is Sunday to Thursday, like in the UAE. Things can be arranged at fairly short notice. So, that's a really great thing, especially given now the freedom of travel once COVID is behind us. Things can happen very quickly. Punctuality is really important here. Israel's come a long way in terms of appreciation and value of time. I remember when I first came to Israel 12 years ago, Israelis would typically turn up significantly late to meetings, but that's changed a lot, and generally things run on time, but of course don't be surprised if sometimes things run late. Communication style is very direct. You'll never be left guessing what an Israeli is thinking. Next slide. We recommend providing an agenda before meetings take place. Business card exchange is very common, of course, when we're meeting in person again. So, be sure to bring along your business cards. English is widely spoken here. Obviously, Hebrew is the national language, but considering no one else in the world speaks Hebrew, Israelis have excellent level of English. So, there'll be no troubles in communicating in meetings. Also, as I mentioned, given the 20% Arab population, and the history. Actually, Arabic is the second official language of Israel and is taught at schools. So some Israelis do speak Arabic. You know, many will have a basic level understanding, if it's, you know, Assalamu alaikum, alaikum salam, sabah al khair, kif halik, things like that. So, you know, learning the same reverse phrases in Hebrew is always appreciated. But all documentation and correspondence, Nimrod and Daniel will attest to that, it all takes place in English for companies, specifically in the high-tech sector, but also other sectors. When it comes to international business, everything's in English. Things can quickly move to first name basis and get quite personable. Next slide. I think that's something that the UAE and Israel have in common. You know, Israelis like to chat, they want to get to know you, and only then will they move on to business. So I think that, you know, that's one of the things that we're going to find commonalities. Expect to be interrupted. Like I said, Israelis are just very direct in their communication style. Don't see it as rude, don't be offended. It's just the way things are done here. It's also very common for Israelis to be on their phones in meetings, answering messages, emails, sometimes taking a call. Internationally less well received, but it seems to be just the way things are done here, so don't be offended. Things are fast paced, which is a great thing. Things can be organized at last minute, deals move quickly and close quickly, and in Israel everything is negotiable. And I will just say that before we end off and I go over what we can do for you, the momentum is great. There is so much excitement here. Every day when I'm on LinkedIn, I see another person posting about a deal that they've already struck, a UAE company they're talking to. I've seen numerous delegations that are going ahead despite the travel restrictions, which I don't quite understand, but somehow Israeli delegations are already going into the UAE. The banks have signed deals. One of the large funds here, Our Crowd, has signed a deal with a Abu Dhabi-based angel investment group. Some of your free zones have already signed MOUs with our chambers of commerce. So things are happening. Everyone's excited. You know, Israeli companies are so keen to get into your market, to collaborate with you. So really try to capitalize on that and you know, start exploring. And then I'll get into what we can do for you. We can really help you understand what's happening here in the Israeli market, do some initial market research for you to understand what your opportunities are. We can conduct due diligence for you on a certain company. It might be a company that's reached out to you and you'd like to know a little bit more about them, or a company that you've come across yourself. We can help you at trade shows. Again, once they start taking place, we can set you up with meetings and so on when you're coming into the market. We can identify agents and distributors for you. We also do representation services. So that's very common for a lot of our American clients. We officially represent them here in the market and act on their behalf, doing, you know, lead generation and trade services. If you do decide that you'd like to establish here in market, we can help you with site selection and also partner selection. We can do introductions for you. We can manage your whole visit, whether it be virtual or physical. Again, hopefully sooner rather than later, we can welcome you here to Israel and start traveling ourselves into your market. Personally, I have been to Dubai because I have an Australian passport. So I was able to travel there myself and loved it, was amazed by the development, the skyscrapers, the shopping malls, the ski fields. So, you know, you can really expect to see a lot of Israelis traveling into the UAE as soon as we're allowed to because of COVID. Israelis love vacationing, love hotels, love theme parks, and are so excited to check out the UAE. So we look forward to working with you going forward and exploring opportunities. And I know we've run out of time, so all the questions that we've received, we will answer them by email. So if you didn't put your questions in the chat bar below, feel free to email us following this webinar. My details are there, as are Joe's. So thank you very much for joining us. We're so excited. And thank you to our guests, Nimrod and Daniel from Yigal, Arnon.
Can you hear me now, Elisa? Am I clear?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, please continue, and I'll wrap up after you.
I'm done. So thanks very much, and I look forward to being in touch with you all going forward.
Brilliant, Lisa. Thank you, and sorry we had technical issues there. It wasn't, you know, the slogan of 2020. You're on mute. I actually wasn't on mute, but anyway, Elisa, thank you. And I didn't get a chance to say thank you to Daniel. And I would also recommend that everyone looks at Elisa's bio, because Elisa was doing this before it was cool, and we all started doing it and was involved in things like the Perez Center for Peace and things. And so has actually spent time and effort and a lot of input on Arab-Israeli development and peace. So it's really cool we're doing this here. We are out of time, and sorry, there were a couple of questions there. I think we've shared or will share everyone's details. We'll send out the this presentation, the recording, and the deck. Please do get in touch with Elisa, myself, and Nimrod or Daniel. Thank you very much for joining wherever you are, and we wish you a good day. Thank you.